Hello, and welcome to Season 0 of the Duncan & Co. History Show. I'm Alexis Coe. My co-host is Mike Duncan. We're two far-flung historian buddies, and this is our wide-ranging archival mix of a show. I'm very excited about today, which Mike will be leading, because we're both from the West Coast. I'm from California, Mike is from Washington State, and you just do not hear a lot of stories about those regions. It's a really East Coast centric history that's told in America. And we're both guilty of that as well. And so it's really exciting today that Mike is telling this story about Oregon Territory and the settlement of the Puget Sound because we get to hear this story. We don't know. And it's a great story. And also because Mike has wanted to tell this story for such a long time and he hasn't really had the right place to put it. This is the place to put it. This is your time. Tell your story.
I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, and that Pacific Northwest local history has always been like a hobby of mine. But yeah, there's not often opportunities when you're talking about great revolutions 200 years ago or the history of Rome to like get stories from the Pacific Northwest out there into the world. But years and years ago, I came across the story of George Bush, who is not that George Bush or even the other George Bush or any other George Bushes that you may have heard of. This George Bush was a leader of the first permanent American settlement on Puget Sound, which was founded in 1845. And yeah, like you said, West Coast history, local history is often sort of really backburnered by the major presses. But this is a story that is not just interesting for local historical reasons. This is a story that sits at the intersection of colonialism and race relations in America and America's relations with the Native Americans. Because the thing about George Bush is that he was Black. And the whole reason he winds up settling on Puget Sound is that when he arrived in the Oregon Territory in 1844, he discovered the provisional government there had enacted an exclusionary law that made it illegal for Blacks to enter Oregon or own property there.
This is why we need West Coast stories. These stories are so much fun. I like this story already. It's a West Coast story, and it's a story about someone being clearly consistently thwarted. And then we get to see what happens and how he wins. I hope. I hope. Is this a happy ending? It's a happy ending. Don't tell
It's a
us.
mixed
Don't tell
bag.
us.
It's a
Don't
mixed
tell us.
bag. It's a mixed bag in the end. It's a happy ending for George Bush. But yeah, this is not a story that we were told growing up in the Pacific Northwest, especially not about the origins of the Oregon Territory. But from the very beginning, the white settlers of the Oregon country were really, really determined to keep Black people out. And this is what George Bush is going to face when he arrives in 1844. And it's why he becomes one of the founders of the state of Washington.
So he's coming to Washington from where? Who is he? What's his story?
George Bush's early life is very obscure. He was most likely born in Philadelphia. We know that he was born free and probably in Philadelphia, although there's some records that say he was born in Virginia. But his parents both worked for a Philadelphia merchant named Stevenson. His mother was an Irish maid whose name I could not ever track down. But his father was a guy called Matthew Bush, an Afro-Caribbean man who was born actually in India and then brought to America sometime before 1776 and probably worked on merchant ships for Stevenson. So George Bush is born at some point in here. The family history says he was born in 1779. The 1850 census says he was born in 1794. The 1860 census says he was born in 1790. So it's just kind of like we don't really know exactly where or when he was born, except to say that he was born free of an Irish mother and a Black father and probably got some kind of decent education growing up.
So do you know who he lived with from the census records?
We know very little, next to nothing, about this early period of his life. And in fact, we don't have much information on him at all for the first 30, 40 years of his life, depending on like when he was born. And there's stories about him, there's family lore. And then if you go out and find like websites about George Bush, you find all of these like stories about him, but they lead to unsourced newspaper articles. Like we don't have documentation for any of these things. So there's like stories that he was in the army and he fought at the Battle of New Orleans, that he was a cattle rancher in Illinois, that he worked for this fur trading company and traveled extensively throughout the American West. But there's no documentation for any of this.
We don't really know a lot because the source material is scant. There are not a lot of primary sources. How does he make his way across the country and end up in Oregon?
The first place we can actually nail him down is in 1828 when he is living in Clay County, Missouri, because we have land records showing him owning 80 acres of land, and he is probably raising cattle. And by all accounts, he's quite successful at this point, and especially for a free black man at the time. Like he is prosperous and successful, so he's not jumping from one place to the next, one step ahead of the law or anything like that. It sure doesn't seem like it. It sure seems like by the time he's settling in Missouri, he's got some capital and he knows what he's doing, and he's quite prosperous.
Did he have an education? How does he get there? How does this start?
The assumption is that he got some kind of education growing up in Philadelphia, and there are stories that he got a Quaker education. But again, like there's no school records. The first time he shows up in the record is in 1828 in Missouri.
So he's a landowner at this point. He's
Mhm.
raising something that's profitable. He seems particularly successful. Is he raising a family? Did he marry?
Yeah, in July of 1830, he marries a woman named Isabella James, and we have a record of that marriage. And she was a white native of Tennessee and the daughter of a Baptist minister. And she will go on to have 9 children, 6 of whom will live.
This is Missouri. That is not a place where marriages are encouraged between Black people and white people, particularly a Black man and a white woman. Did they face challenges in their lives together, in their family?
The answer to that seems to be yes, but also no. Like yes and no. Because wherever George and Isabella wind up, when their neighbors talk about them, they speak very highly of them, and they're always respected members of the local community. George Bush himself is prosperous. He has a reputation for generosity. So he's got a lot of friends. And then he clearly knows how to exist inside of a white society. So, yes, this is a mixed marriage in a place where mixed marriages are very much frowned upon. But a guy named John Minter, who was one of the members of Bush's wagon train in 1844, said of him, and this is archaic language, but quote, Bush was a mulatto, but he had means, and also a white woman for a wife and a family of 5 children. Not many men of color left a slave state so well to do and so generally respected.
If he's well to do and generally respected, is he leaving just because one can never have assurances in a slave state?
Yeah, you get the feeling that things are dicey legally. And it's very likely that while many friends and neighbors love him, not everyone loves him, right? This is Missouri in the 1830s and 1840s. And so a guy named Ezra Meeker, who is another Northwest pioneer, and honestly, a guy we could do an entire episode about.
With a name like that, yes.
Yeah,
Can you
Ezra Meeker.
just give us like two, just give us two things.
He basically introduced hop cultivation into the Northwest and is the founding father of Northwest beer culture. And he's also
What?
and he's also the reason why the Oregon Trail is a thing, like in the historical memory. He spent decades lobbying Congress to get all these markers put up because he came across on the Oregon Trail. He lived to be 100 years old. Ezra Meeker is crazy.
That was like 5 things and they were all good.
Yeah. Ezra Meeker is great. And he met Bush in 1853. And then he later wrote, George Bush doubtless left Missouri because of the virulent prejudices against his race in the community where he lived. Right. This is sort of like, why did he leave in the first place? And then later, a descendant named Amabel Bush told an interviewer in the 1960s, I'm not sure why George came west in 1844. As far as I know, he was having a hard time in Missouri. People would not sell him anything because they said he was a Negro. That's probably one reason why he wanted to leave. But also, like, lots of people are about to start moving west. And, while we could obviously point to his status as a black man in Missouri as a reason to get out of Dodge, like, lots of people were leaving on the Oregon Trail. So I'm sure, like, lots of different things factored into it.
Okay, so when does he decide to hit the Oregon Trail? It sounds like there might have been a precipitating factor, an economic drive to leave. But when does he actually leave?
Him and his neighbors and friends clearly start talking about this in the early 1840s. Settlers have been departing west for Oregon from Missouri since the mid 1830s. Missouri is the embarkation point for the Oregon Trail. So lots of people are now going from Missouri directly out to the Oregon country.
Yes, everybody knows this. When you play Oregon Trail, you start in Independence, Missouri.
Yes, exactly. So George and Isabella are talking this over with their friends and neighbors. They form a party of 5 families. This is parents and children. And these are Michael and Elizabeth Simmons, James and Charlotte McAllister, David and Talithia Kindred, Gabriel and Kezia Jones. And they decide they're going to go out on the Oregon Trail. And again, George has this reputation for generosity, and George and Isabella cover the funds for 2 of these families so that to buy the wagons and all the provisions that they're going to need. So it's not like all of these families could have done it on their own. George is putting up the money for them. And what these people don't know is they're about to become the first settlers of Puget Sound and among the founders of the state of Washington.
I always love the story of how it is you do learn the gold rush history, which I feel like people on the East Coast don't really learn. They know that it happened, but you learn a lot about the gold rush and missions in California. And so I always love like why people ended up settling where they did. It's so arbitrary. Rarely did they make it to their actual destination. They're like, this is good enough. But are these families of color?
No, these are all white families. Bush is
Oh,
the one black man inside this party.
okay. All right. And they're traveling by wagon. So this is a wagon train.
Yeah, they are the Bush Simmons party, or sometimes they're just called the Simmons party. I'll probably refer to them as the Bush party through this because it's a story about George Bush. But yeah, they join a larger wagon train that departs Missouri in May of 1844.
Did I tell you that I went on a wagon ride for 7 days?
You have told me you went on a wagon ride for 7 days.
So I can speak to this that must have been a terrible journey.
Yeah, none of the stories that I've ever heard about actually making it west sound particularly pleasant.
And you can't go that fast. I went 3 miles per hour. It would take a day on a wagon or a horse or a donkey to get, from point A to point B, and you could drive there in a half an hour.
Yeah.
All right, so they are going to Washington.
They're going to the Oregon country. They are going to the Oregon territory. Washington doesn't exist yet.
Okay, so they're going to the Oregon Territory. What does that mean? Which power had it?
The Oregon territory is a very loose term. It is not legally defined. It's not a territory of the United States in a legal sense, but it basically covers what is today Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, plus little bits of Montana and Wyoming. And this area is claimed by the United States, but it is also claimed by the British. The British and Americans signed a treaty in 1818 that was settling a bunch of outstanding border disputes between Britain and the United States, both dating back to the Revolution and also from the recent War of 1812. And what they decided to do was set the boundary between Canada and the United States at the 49th parallel, but only extended that to the Rocky Mountains. And then they just left the lands west of the Rocky Mountains indeterminate. And they actually signed up for a joint occupation of the area, that both Americans and British people would have free navigation rights, and authorities working for both the Americans or the British would have some kind of legal jurisdiction over the area.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Yeah, joint occupations, I'm sure, have a long and flourishing history.
But who's living there?
When they signed the treaty in 1818, there's practically no white people or Europeans out there. It
But they're
is
native people, they're
Yep.
indigenous people.
Yep. It's the native indigenous tribes. And today there are 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. There are 29 in Washington. But obviously that does not capture the truth or complexity of who these people were, what tribes were there, what nations were there. And there were probably more than 100 distinct groups. And population numbers are hard to come by, but in the coastal areas where the Bush party winds up, an anthropologist named Robert Boyd wrote a book called The Coming of the Spirit of Pestilence, which is about infectious diseases and population decline in the Northwest, estimated that there were probably 180,000 Native people who were living there in the 1770s, which is when the Europeans show up. And then that figure declined to 35 to 40,000 by the 1850s because they were decimated mostly by smallpox. So in the 1840s, you have kind of a decimated population of natives and some Europeans because they had shown up in the 1770s, and beginning in the mid 1830s you get settlers moving across the continent into that area.
The Coming of the Spirit of Pestilence. Such a good title. And that's when American and British settlers are moving in.
Yeah, settlers really start showing up in the 1830s. But crucially, it is American settlers, not really British settlers. So, in practice, what went on with the joint occupation is that the Americans who were in the area controlled everything south of the Columbia River, and the British pretty much controlled everything north of the Columbia River. And if you're not familiar with Northwest geography, the Columbia River is what divides Washington and Oregon. But the British mode of governance, what they were doing out there was to run everything through the Hudson Bay Company, which was mostly interested in trading goods for furs. And they just built some trading outposts. That's all that they were doing. The British presence is all trappers and traders, doing business with the local tribes. And they had good relations with those natives because the British weren't really encroaching on anything. But again, starting in the 1830s, American settlers start streaming through the mountains, and they are numbering about 9,000 by the 1840s.
So, in this cohabitation, the British are doing trapping and trading, but the Americans are doing the settler colonialism.
Yeah, full blown settler colonialism. And as we were about to find out, and as George Bush is about to find out, an explicitly racist form of settler colonialism. So Bush and his party leave Missouri in May 1844. In June of 1844, while they are on the road, the Oregon Provisional Government passes its first, because there will be several, black exclusionary laws. This law was introduced by a guy named Peter Burnett, who had migrated just in 1843, just the year before, and he came from Missouri too. And he shows up in Oregon, and he was there for less than a year before he concluded, we need to start keeping black people out of here. And the law stated that blacks were not allowed to enter or reside in the Oregon Territory, and that the punishment would be 39 public lashes administered once every 6 months until the person departed.
Oh, so it's all because of this guy Peter Burnett.
Well, he's the one who introduced it. The other people in the Oregon Provisional Government were happy to go along with it.
All right. So does Bush know this?
This is not something I've been able to figure out. The law obviously did not exist when they set out in May. What I don't know is whether they found out about it while they were on the trail or if it was not until they arrived. But again, we have a quote from John Minter, who was one of these guys who was in the party with Bush, said and that's Bush, he told me he should watch when we got to Oregon what usage was awarded to people of color. And if he could not have a free man's rights, he would seek the protection of the Mexican government in California or New Mexico.
Ooh.
Yeah, so he is aware of the way white people are. And when he arrives in Oregon, though, and discovers he does not, in fact, have a free man's rights, he's going to go north and not south.
I mean, that's fine because soon the Mexican-American War will happen. Okay, so what happens to George Bush, a black man, when he arrives in this territory that's now banned his presence?
They arrive in December of 1844, and they break off from the larger train that they had been a part of, and those people all moved down into the Willamette Valley. And the Bush party was originally supposed to head south to the Rogue River, but they can't now go into Oregon without major trouble. So instead, they stay north, they hug the Columbia River, and try to figure out what to do. And the party of families that they departed with stayed together. Like that little group of families did not break apart because Bush alone could not go into Oregon. They stuck together. They didn't leave him and Isabella and their children high and dry. And eventually they concluded that, well, if we can't live in the American controlled area because they've gotten super racist, let's go north into the British controlled areas.
And the British are okay with this?
Officially, no. British officials were supposed to actively discourage American settlement north of the Columbia River, because if the Americans gain footholds north of the Columbia, it's going to upset British claims to the territory. But the factor of the Hudson Bay Company, that's just the leader of the Hudson Bay Company out there, a guy named John McLaughlin, was way chiller about things. And he was always happy to trade and provision Americans when they show up. So McLaughlin works with the Bush party. He lets them get supplied on credit, and he even will give them letters of recommendation so that when they head north, they can show it to this other Hudson's Bay fort to get further provision. And we have a record of this that said, quote, "They have all conducted themselves in a most neighborly, friendly manner, and I beg to recommend them to your kind assistance and friendly offices."
So they head north with a letter of recommendation. What happened?
Yeah, they head north into the wilderness. They scouted some locations in the summer of 1845. They landed a spot on Puget Sound near Deschutes Falls. And in October of 1845, they set out north with a party of about 30 people. And they spend 15 days literally cutting a road through the forests and reach Puget Sound on November the 6th, 1845. And there they found a settlement they dub Newmarket, which will go on to become the oldest permanent American settlement on Puget Sound. And it is today the city of Tumwater, right next to what becomes the state capital of Olympia. And then Bush and his family get this wide open area that's south of Newmarket that will become known as Bush's Prairie.
And there's no issue with Bush living there or owning property.
Right. That's the whole point, to get away from the racists down in Oregon so that Bush can also be a property owner. And this whole crew establishes good relations with the local British traders and outposts. And most importantly, they develop very good relations with the local Native Americans, like even like great relations with them. The area that they're in was the home to the Nisqually people, and their leader is a guy named Leschi. And Bush and his friends trade with the Nisqually. They learn from them. They're hanging out with them. And Leschi is coming and going from Newmarket and Bush Prairie like all the time. They become very close with each other.
But we know this isn't going to end well for the Nisqually, unless this is the exception to every story that starts out this way.
It is not.
Can Bush settle in and prosper?
Nearly. But he's going to have to go through one more ordeal because the British and Americans are about to resolve their ambiguous boundaries in the Pacific Northwest, like literally right at this same moment here in the mid 1840s.
James K. Polk, Manifest Destiny, make up a scuffle on the border so you can declare a war.
Right. Americans at this point, well, and today too, think the whole continent ought to belong to them, or at least as much as they can seize. And down in the Southwest, that's going to trigger the Mexican-American War, which is the American invasion, conquest, and annexation of northern Mexico. And then in the Northwest, it's defined by this slogan, 54-40 or fight, which maybe you remember from some social studies textbook in the 8th grade. But this is an expansionist American demand to claim the Oregon Territory, not to the 49th parallel, but all the way to the 54th parallel, which would have extended the United States to include all of what is today British Columbia. And Polk himself, President Polk, was a supporter of the 54-40 line. But in 1846, with the invasion of Mexico ramping up, he does not want to start a war with the British over some forests a couple thousand miles away. And the British agree. They don't want to get into a war with Americans over this. So in June of 1846, they sit down and pretty quickly actually hammer out a deal. The British wanted to claim everything down to the Columbia River. The Americans wanted everything up to the 54-40 line. So they said, let's split the difference. Let's just keep running the 49th parallel, which is today the border between the United States and Canada. But you know what this means, don't you?
I do. I think I know what this means.
With the ratification of the Oregon Treaty of 1846, the territory Bush has moved into, a permanent settlement that in fact helped bolster American claims to the region, is now under the jurisdiction of the Oregon Provisional Government and its Black exclusionary laws.
It's like it's chasing him.
Yes. But it is worth noting that the law was modified by 1846. It had been modified.
Modification means that it was just slightly changed.
Yeah, in December of 1845, the punishment for a Black person residing in Oregon was no longer 39 lashes. It was forced public labor.
So a form of slavery.
No, slavery was outlawed in the territory. This is involuntary public labor because you're a Black person. So right. Different.
Bush is now faced with this problem again, but he's actually settled in now. He has a choice to make again.
Yeah, and it's getting ominous because in 1848, Oregon does become an official U.S. territory, which is one of the steps on the way to statehood. And in 1849, the Oregon Territorial Legislature affirmed the exclusionary law and that prohibited, quote, and again, archaic language, Negro or mulattoes to enter into or reside within the limits of this territory. And just to push ahead a little bit here, Oregon really sticks to its guns about this. This is a big thing for them. In 1850, Congress passed a Donation Land Act that allowed white men and white married women to receive up to 640 acres of free land in the Oregon Territory, which also specifically excluded Black people from taking advantage of it. And then when Oregon formally became a state in 1859, the state constitution banned slavery, but also made it illegal for Blacks to own real estate, make contracts, vote, or use the legal system. So Oregon is meant to be whites only.
Very, very clearly.
But in the 1840s and early 1850s, there's very little the Oregon territorial legislature can do to project power north of the Columbia River. They can't enforce these exclusionary laws. And Bush is really set up, and they achieve pretty remarkable levels of prosperity. Bush himself was regarded as a very good farmer. They're producing wheat, rye, oats, and hops, little bits of hops. They're making wool and butter. They've got horses and cattle and sheep and pigs. Like this is Bush Prairie becomes a really, really prosperous farm. And this success leads to more settlers turning north when they get basically to the Columbia River. About 1,000 people moved north by 1850, and another 12,000 would come over the next decade. And Bush becomes renowned for being super generous to anybody who shows up. And Ezra Meeker, who we talked about before, was one of the people who comes up in 1852. And he said, quote, "The man divided out nearly his whole crop to new settlers who came with or without money. Pay me in kind next year," he would say to those in need. And to those who had money, he would say, "Don't take too much, just enough to do you." And in this wise divided his large crop and became a benefactor of the whole community. And then Bush himself is finally quoted by Elizabeth McClagan in her book. It's called Peculiar Paradise, A History of Blacks in Oregon, 1788 to 1940. And she said, and this is Bush talking, "I'll just keep my grain to let my neighbors who have had failures have enough to live on and for seeding their fields in the spring. They have no money to pay your fancy prices, and I don't intend to see them want for anything in my power to provide them with."
So he's really ingrained in the community. He's got a lot of goodwill, I would assume, from all this.
Most people who are moving north into what becomes Washington, one of their first stops is the area around New Market and Bush Prairie. So they all know him. And this community is going to look out for him. And in the early 1850s, settlers north of the Columbia petitioned Congress to carve out a new thing called the Washington Territory, which they specifically wanted to call it the Washington Territory to incentivize the boys back in DC to give them this new thing so they can look at a map and see something big named after Washington. And then on March the 2nd, 1853, the area between the Columbia River and Canada was split off from Oregon and organized as the new Washington Territory.
So that means that Bush is no longer under Oregon's anti-Black jurisdiction, right? Yes?
Correct.
For like a
Correct.
minute.
No, he's pretty good now. Because again, like everybody in Washington Territory knows George Bush and loves George Bush. And when the Washington Territorial Legislature meets for the first time in March of 1854, they approved unanimously a petition to Congress that would allow Bush specifically as an individual to claim the 640 acres that he was entitled to under the Donation Land Act, which is how he would be able to cement his ownership of the land that he settled. And on February the 10th, 1855, the U.S. Congress actually passed a special act just for him. It was called an Act for the Relief of George Bush of Thurston County, Washington Territory, that says, among other things, quote, "The claim of George Bush to 640 acres of land in Thurston County, Washington Territory, in virtue of his early settlement, continued residence, and cultivation, is hereby confirmed, the one half to said George Bush, the other half to his wife."
50-50.
Yeah.
Women don't even have independent citizenship at this point. That's kind of amazing. Like if their husband dies, they're stateless.
Yeah.
But she
So
has half of this territory.
she gets half the land. Now, of course, this is all shaping up to have a happy ending for the Bush family. It pretty much does, but it is a unhappy ending for their friends in the Nisqually. Bush and his family, as I said, have been friends with them. They learned the Nisqually language. Their last son was born out here in 1847, and he's named Louis Nisqually Bush.
Wow.
But the influx of settlers is changing relations between the settlers and the native communities. And with the creation of the Washington Territory in 1853, we get a new territorial governor, the first territorial governor, and he's a guy named Isaac Stevens.
These guys are usually the worst.
Yeah, Isaac Stevens is a bastard. He is considered controversial in
Oh,
Washington
God.
history, which means he's a bastard.
It means he's terrible.
Right. Isaac Stevens was a lifelong soldier. He goes on to serve in the Union Army and he dies in the Civil War. But before that, he was a politically minded guy, and he was the chair of the national committee for John Breckinridge's campaign in 1860. And Breckinridge is the pro-slavery Southern Democrat who Lincoln beats in the 1860 election. Stevens was campaigning for him actively.
So what does he do? What does he do?
Stevens becomes known for his horrible treatment of the local native peoples. We could all see this coming. In late 1854, Stevens pushed through the infamous Treaty of Medicine Creek, which is, again, notorious in local Pacific Northwest history. It is signed by 9 tribes, including the Nisqually, and forced them to cede 2.25 million acres. And in exchange, they would get 3 reservations totaling 1,200 acres and $32,000. Now, this is a terrible treaty, and it is signed by 62 leaders of these native peoples, which historians have now established a bunch of those who were named did not sign. They were not even there. They weren't even signatures being forged. They were like X's on a piece of paper. But Stevens essentially forges a bunch of signatures to get this treaty pushed through, which enrages the local native tribes and also the Bush family, who support and sympathize with them, not with Isaac Stevens.
This enrages them, but it also inexorably changes their lives. Does this put the Bush family in contention with Stevens?
Very much so. And what this does is it kicks off what we call the Puget Sound War, which their old friend, Leschi, who was
I'm
the
sorry,
leader
but
of the,
that does sound like a Death Cab for Cutie song.
the Puget Sound War.
Uh-huh. Continue.
Yeah. So their old friend, Leschi, leads the Nisqually and other groups into armed revolt because they went to the reservation that they were supposed to be on. It's obviously the worst land. These are river people who fish for a living, and they've been removed from waterways. So they go into revolt. And the Puget Sound War is defined by skirmishes between local natives and white militias and some regular soldiers from the fall of 1855 through the spring of 1856, when the natives have to give it up because they're being overwhelmed. Bush and his family refuse to have anything to do with this. They do not join the militias. They do not fight with them. They do not provision them. They blame Stevens for all of this. And they are a part of the community in Washington that is always going to be trash talking Stevens and everything that he had done. And one of Bush's sons said, Leschi was as good a friend as we ever had. And this war divides the white community, especially when Stevens declared martial law in Pierce County in April of 1856 to stop what he saw as collaboration between natives and whites. And then this is a fun little tangent that we're going to go down because it does have some relevance to today. Stevens did not have the authority to declare martial law, and he was found in contempt of court by the Chief Justice of the Washington Territory. And what Isaac Stevens did is he pardoned himself. And we have there's a record of this where it says, quote, that I, Isaac Stevens, governor of the said territory by virtue of the authority vested in me as governor as aforesaid, in order that the president of the United States may be fully advised in the premises and his pleasure known thereon, do hereby respite the said Isaac Stevens, defendant, from execution of said judgment and all proceedings.
Amazing.
Great stuff. So the final tragic act of all of this is that after the fighting peters out, Leschi and a few of his followers fled east across the Cascades. But Stevens has it in for him. Leschi is hunted down and, at Stevens' order, is charged with the murder of 2 Washington Territorial volunteers. And this is incredibly controversial because he's afforded no recognition of being like a combatant, that this was done during lawful combat. He is charged with murder. And because of that, Leschi is hanged on February the 19th, 1854.
Oh,
Which further enrages the locals, like the Bush family, who had been friends with him forever. And, Leschi had helped the locals get going, and then he was driven into rebellion and hanged for it.
this is the story of America. These are the stories we have to be telling at our 250.
Yeah. And these are the stories that I certainly did not learn growing up. Nobody told me any of these things. Not a part of any local curriculum that I was ever aware of. I had to learn all this stuff as an adult. But just to wrap things up here, by 1860, the Bush family held about 880 acres, and they were continued to be one of the most prosperous families in the region. And then in April of 1863, George Bush dies of a cerebral hemorrhage. And then a few years later, in September of 1866, Isabella died too.
Does the family go on? Do the children stay in the area?
Yeah, the Bush family are, local pillars of the community for decades. They continue to go on and be prosperous. They serve in various like local municipal roles. And then, over time, Bush Prairie gets broken up, and like I think that I think part of the family still own part of the land like into the mid 20th century, but by then, the whole thing had their family line just spread and dispersed.
So the story you've just told us about a new George Bush, who we didn't know, who preceded the George Bushes we do know, made his way west to escape racism and racial violence and prejudice. And it followed him everywhere he went. And that part of his life, that struggle, concludes in this bittersweet way. He gets what he needs, and then he sees another group that has been persecuted by white men get the opposite. And he sees his friend, someone who helped him in the beginning, and he's someone who believes in helping people. So he must deeply appreciate when people help him. Hanged for fighting in a war for survival, hanged as if it was a random act of violence. And then they have to go and live their lives among these people, among Stevens, who's pardoned himself. It's a beautiful story. It's a heartbreaking story. It's as American as apple pie.
Yeah, exactly. And like this is how the United States expanded, right? It is explicit racism inside the system that is expanding. And then as that system expands, it's brutal purges of anybody outside the system. Like that is the story. And like when I was growing up with the Oregon Trail and Lewis and Clark, it's all these fun stories of pioneers having adventures. And all of this really true history of what was going on at the time is again not handed down to us, and I discovered it years later and have been sitting on this story for a really long time, which like I said, I never had a venue for trying to get this one out into the collective consciousness, but I'm happy to have done so here with you today.
I'm so glad you told it. This was the Duncan and Co. History Show. I'm Alexis Co. He's Mike Duncan, and that's our show.